Let's see. Thought it was it's up here, maybe on the kiosk. You know, instead of those were the screens. Hello. I'm trying to put my slides up here.
Good idea. You just got here?
Oh no, I was in the office. I had to do a webinar presentation. Finished at 2:30.
Oh, here's the guy who does real estate. Hey, how's it going?
Good. I'm trying to put this in there.
Okay.
Oh, here we go.
All right. Where is it here?
Should be just put today's date.
Oh, okay.
Yes, yeah, that's one.
All right. Great.
It's a very large file.
Anything special in it? Videos or audio or anything?
The first one is a video.
First one is a video. Okay.
I think you should play it.
Okay. Where is it?
First titles.
Oh, that first title is a video? Okay. So, you want me to test it, or?
Yeah, you can just put it on and just keep it running on.
Is there any audio in there?
No.
Very fancy, I like it. Okay. Do you have any audio coming out of your presentation at all?
No, I'm just not, me talking.
Just you talking, okay.
Oh, this is great. I have presentation view also. That's good.
Do you want to use a lavalier to walk around a little bit, or?
Yes, maybe I'd do better.
Okay, sure. Probably put it right there in the center of your tie. And what time? We don't start at
3 at 3.
Oh, okay, yeah. You'll just press and hold the power button right there.
Okay.
And then it'll be on. I'll check with you though too. So,
Okay.
All right.
This is the pointer. Yeah.
So this will, I have to go stand out there.
Yeah, you can't do the stand in front. Yep.
Is there a turning point from here? Will this show it?
Well, it's extended, so you could try turning that off and reduplicate.
This is, no, this is.
Yeah, you could do that. That's a laser pointer. And you just choose laser pointer.
Yeah, so let's put it here.
But it doesn't. Since we're in presentation mode, it'll show your notes here, so it's not showing right there. Well, is it? No, it is. Yeah.
It is. It is.
Yeah. It is.
Yeah, yeah. I'll just keep it here.
Okay, cool.
Okay, and this is forward. I can do it from.
Yeah.
Okay. We all set. It takes time and effort. A lot of searching. You can buy these things from Shutterstock. So you can buy these different videos and stuff like that.
I think we're ready to get started with the keynote address. I heard on NPR the other day that it's a great time to be a historian because those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. Someone great said that, and I think that is important right now, as it is to be a toxicologist. I think these are trying times with extreme wildfires, changes in the climate that bring about a challenge to our resiliency. So I think it's important to be a toxicologist, and we welcome you all here to share in our studies in toxicology, and I want to applaud all the presenters. Platform and posters alike have been fantastic, so thank you for all your hard work. It was really a pleasure to hear what you had to say. Without further ado, let me introduce our keynote speaker. I've known Dr. Bhatnagar for some time. Over 2 decades. We'll go no longer than that, just so you can't judge exactly how long. But we have a mind meld that goes back to studying aldehydes as mediators of toxicity in the cardiovascular system, but certainly other organ systems as well. We now look to larger realms, the envirome, and I'm going to let Dr. Bhatnagar take that over. He's the new director of the newly formed Envirome Institute here at the University of Louisville, and we look forward to seeing what new horizons the Envirome Institute will take on. Rooney.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dan, for the invitation, and thank you, everyone, for being here. This is what I thought I'll do today was to give you, or at least to introduce you to a new concept that we've been working on, which we call the envirome. It has to do with our understanding of how the environment affects human health and well-being, and then sort of give you a little introduction of what the components of the envirome are, what does it constitute of, and then sort of tell you something about the new institute we created at the University of Louisville, and then sort of a very unusual project that we are working on, which is part of the institute. So in the last century, we collectively sequenced the human genome. And we had for the first time a blueprint of what is the complete sort of sequence of the human genome, and we call that the envirome. So we now know the exact sequences of the genes that are in the human genome, how do they interact, and what is the general ontology of the interaction between different genes in a human being. But genes are only half of the story. In addition to genes, of course, there is the importance of the environment. And us as human beings and any living phenotype comes into being because of the interaction between the genes and the environment. We may have really efficient genes capable of manifesting themselves, but they do not do so unless they are in a conducive environment. Therefore, genes and environment are part of the same puzzle. But the environment exerts a very important influence. Not only is the environment a key determinant in our health and well-being, but also plays an active role in natural selection. So in the natural selection equation, the environment is the selector. So we know that when living in environments that are conducive to our ancestral genomes, we are in a sort of a state which we call adapted. However, when there is a change in the environment, then the genes may or may not be adapted to the environment, and so there is either positive selection or negative selection that restores the state of adaptation. And so in some sense, this common sort of interaction between the genes and the environment is critical for any biology to develop, manifest, evolve, and grow. However, the environment varies from one living system to another, and this is particularly a complicated issue in how do we comprehend the human environment, particularly because the human environment is a very complicated sort of set of systems. We as humans exist in very large social networks, and these social networks we have fashioned over the centuries because of our own unique culture and history. So it is not a simple task, perhaps even more complicated than decoding the genome, is to understand the human environment and how it affects the manifestation not only of our genes, but also of our sort of health and disease risk. Diseases can arise in the context of the environmental change because we are living in environments that are not conducive to our genetic origins. As I showed, that there may be maladaptation between our genes and the environment that may arise because of a mismatch between the rate of change of the genes and the rate of change in the environment. In general, the rate of change of the environment usually exceeds the rate of change in the genes, and so we would submit that we live in a state of chronic maladaptation with the environment, no matter how conducive that environment might be. We can also be impaired because of the dyssynchrony between the environment that we live in and our genes, and that could also extend to the synchrony between ourselves and the natural cycles of our environment, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. And primarily, there may be always a continuous difference between our genes and the environment. So with these general principles, I want to sort of talk to you about today is about one particular disease state which I've been working on, and Dan has been working on with us, as the coronary heart disease, or as we can call it for short, heart disease, and sort of present to you a case of why we think that this is a quintessential or a paradigmatic environmental disease, and what can we learn by looking at heart disease as an environmental disease. And then maybe we can talk a little bit about how this fits into the broader concept of disease management and toxicological evaluation. So the idea that I'm going to sort of develop is that environmental changes can significantly affect coronary heart disease, which speaks to its nature as an environmental disease. So why do we say that? So first line of evidence comes from the United States, where people from Japan, particularly from Hiroshima, moved to the islands of Hawaii and then to San Francisco. And when people moved from one environment to another, that there was actually a great increase in the risk for coronary heart disease. And this is interesting because we do not know what components of the environment are imparting this excessive risk, but only that the risk is very significantly modified by a change in the environment. There's some recent work showing that people, when they migrate from one environment to another, actually have a complete change in their gut microbiome. So that could be one sort of insight of why the environment has such an important influence. But even if you stay in the same place, your disease risk can change if the environment changes. And this is data from Finland showing that from 1971 to 1995, there was a 65% decrease in the overall incidence of cardiovascular disease within that community. And certainly, if there were strong genetic components to this disease, you would expect such a large change just because of change in the environmental conditions. So it suggests that there are things in the environment, in this case in Finland, was sort of activation or implementation of newer agriculture policies. When Finland was a country by itself and independent, they had a lot of subsidies on lark and pork, and when they joined the EU, they could get fresh fruits and vegetables all year round and change the incidence of heart disease significantly. So certainly also sort of speaks to the fact that strong social changes can have much larger impact on disease incidence and outcomes than much medicine can. The reverse example comes from China, which shows that from 1984 to 1999, there was a 50% increase in the incidence of heart disease, and that was accompanied by a change in the lifestyle of people in China, adaptation to the westernization and Western food and Western diet, as well as fast foods. So you could see that the incidence of the disease can vary widely depending upon what the environmental conditions would be. As a result, we could now sort of with some certainty conclude that about 60 to 80% of the risk of heart disease and diabetes could be attributed to environmental causes. And this is not only true for heart disease. Less than 93% or 97% of cancer could in fact be linked to environmental causes, and only in 3% of the cases, perhaps in some cases of breast cancer with the HER2 gene, and perhaps prostate cancer, most cancers have environmental origin. So if the environment is so important and is a chief determinant of not only our health and well-being, but also our disease risk, then how do we understand the environment as an entity, as an entirely self-contained system? So that's why we turn to the concept of the envirome, and the concept is that just like the genome, that the envirome functions as one unit for one individual person, although we share many elements of the environment between ourselves, but there are some components of our environment that are unique to us, just like our genes. We also share the concept is that envirome by itself has many components, and it's been well recognized. I'm sure you've heard of social determinants of disease, lifestyle choices, but they're generally understood as discrete entities in an environment. So the claim here is that yes, there are different determinants of disease, of the different components of the environment but that these components have an identifiable structure, that we could understand the relationship between different components of the environment and then be able to then identify the causes of the environmental origins of disease. And again, of all the diseases that are caused by the environment, it seems the greatest burden seems to be on cardiovascular disease. And this is data from the WHO showing a worldwide mortality that has been linked to global adverse exposure to adverse environments. And here you see that most of the disease, or a very large fraction of the disease, is due to cardiovascular causes. So if we understand how the environment affects heart disease, then we can go back and look at how other diseases are affected by the environment as well, and how we can understand also the nature of the disease and its relationship to the environment. So if we look at the different components of our environment, we could actually identify 3 distinct domains. And these domains are nested between one another. There is, of course, the natural environment, which is the most primeval or the primordial environment which encompasses the earth. Now nested within the social and between the natural environment is a social environment, which we create from our interactions with nature. And within this social environment is our own personal microenvironment, which is called the personal environment, or which is populated by the lifestyle choices that we make. The idea then is that each component of this environment affects human health, and we have to understand them separately to see how they function in the separate domains, but also how these domains interact for their integrated effect on human health and disease risk. So first, let's look at the natural environment. The natural environment, as I mentioned, is an environment that is sort of precedes humans and is the most primitive, primordial, and perhaps essential component of our environment. This environment consists of many different components, and these components could include the basic geosphere of around us, as well as a biosphere. We know that the components of the geosphere, such as location and climate and geography, have an effect on human health, and then, but also they can affect the production of pollutants, and that could affect health indirectly, and I think we'll talk about each of these in a minute. There's also the biosphere. For example, we have microbes and plants and animals around us, and there is some evidence to suggest that people who live in more biodiverse areas actually seem to do better, that there are people who are actually exposed to microbes early in life are resistant to autoimmune diseases. For example, children who grew up in farms around animals and play in the dirt are much more sort of resistant to asthma. There have also been reports that people who live around areas which have pollen and fungus and dander and so on seem to have a more educated immune system. It has been suggested that these microbes co-evolve with us, and they are known as old friends. And these are old friends hypothesis. And if we live in ultra-clean environments where we are deprived of our old friends, our immune system doesn't get educated and responds sort of in aberrant ways. So if we are going to then understand each of these components, we could examine how they affect disease, and again, in this case, heart disease. So let's begin with the cycles of night and day. This is the most primitive feature of life on this planet, and we know that all life is entrained to this cycle. In the heart, 35% of your genes vary as a function of the night and day cycle. And certainly if your own body clock is desynchronized with the external environment, it profoundly increases your risk of developing diabetes, as well as for developing heart disease and insulin resistance. There is also some work in which one of the projects that we are doing within the Institute is to see how these changes in circadian rhythms would affect susceptibility to toxins and susceptibility to pollutants. But the cycles of night and day are on a shorter span, the longer span cycles of the seasons, and there is evidence that changes in the seasons can also affect how we can manage our cardiovascular disease risk. And we do know that cardiovascular mortality in many areas of the world is much lower than it is in summer than it's in winter. We do not know the exact reasons, but one of the reasons may be that there is different levels of vitamin D that are available. We have often forgotten, but we are like plants. We actually undertake photosynthesis. We synthesize vitamin D from UV light, just like plants synthesize food. And without the right exposure, sunlight, that we would not sort of flourish. So There is a very large deficiency of vitamin D across the globe. In the United States, about 50 to 60% are chronically vitamin D deficient. We know that there are a lot of functions, both in the cardiovascular tissues as well as in the kidney and in the brain and in the nervous system, and as well as the immune system, that critically depend on vitamin D levels. So we see that there is a strong dependence, and each sort of group of communities of human beings, as they evolved, have adapted a certain latitude which matches their skin color and has a sort of a match with the amount of UV light that they receive. The latitude also plays an important role in regulating blood pressure. We know people who live near the equator have much lower prevalence of blood pressure than people who live closer to the poles or away from the blood pressure. So latitude determines your sort of blood pressure as well as the risk of hypertension. And this has been observed both as you go north from the equator or south from the equator, which means that the amount of sunlight that a community receives is a good indicator of the amount of prevalence of hypertension within that community. But light is one thing. The other important sort of primordial component of our environment are plants, and there have been much work done that has shown that their proximity to green spaces is strongly associated with much better health and much better disease outcomes. There is one really startling study that came out from the United States. We are currently experiencing an infestation of the ash borer beetle, which is killing off all the ash trees. To date, the beetle has killed over 12 million trees in the United States. And this epidemic started from the northern parts of the country and is now moving south. And as we can see that as the epidemic progresses, you lose trees in a community, there is a corresponding increase in the trees as well. So in communities where trees die, people die as well. And so we have not been able to understand the strength or leave alone the mechanism of this risk or this association. But I think that's an important thing to study. Certainly just killing off trees or the loss of trees in a community can lead to a 15% increase in cardiovascular mortality. I think it's time for us to sit up and take notice. But there's also the component of the environment which relates not just to the trees and things in it, but also altitude. We know that people who live in higher altitudes are actually protected from cardiovascular disease, and that this could have to do with the ancestry of where people belong. For example, people who have lived in Tibet, and the Tibetans have an ancestry exceeding 50,000 years, that these individuals have lower pulmonary pressure. They can withstand lower levels of oxygen. Their hemoglobin has been mutated to have a higher capacity for oxygen. They have much better perfusion even when the women there are pregnant, so they do not have adverse outcomes, birth outcomes. Other populations which are not yet as well adapted, for example, the Andean Indians, who have only been there at high altitudes for 20,000 years, are in the process of adapting to high altitude. They still have muscularization of the pulmonary artery, and they have right ventricular hypertrophy. But if you look at the coronary tree of a person from the Andes, especially a native from Andes, you have twice the density of coronary arteries than you would have from a sea-dwelling persons. And this effect of the environment can appear at birth, but can also be momentarily induced. And perhaps sometimes when people are born in this high altitude, they maintain the advantage even when they move to lower altitudes. So this comes from a study from Switzerland, which shows that when people are, for every 100-meter increase in the altitude, there is about 0.7, the RR decreases from 1 to 0.78. And then if you move above to a higher altitude, you can experience sort of a gain in health, and when you move down, there's increased mortality. So even for a short period of time, if you can go to high altitudes, that changes your cardiovascular physiology and affects both your cardiac function as well as your lipoprotein profile. So the natural environment, of course, has a dramatic and actually a very significant effect on our health, but we as humans have tried to separate ourselves from the natural environment, and that has been the fundamental program of human civilization, which has been to defend ourselves from the forces and the vagaries of nature. So what we have done is we have created an artificial social environment around ourselves, and much of our lives are now spent around socially created environments than the natural primitive environments. And for the last few centuries, the social environment has become become the chief determinant of our health rather than the natural environment. Although the influences of the natural environment have not gone away, we have sort of failed, even though when we fail to recognize the influence, but we have been able to sort of create these little environments around ourselves which distance ourselves from the influences of the natural forces. The social environments are rather complex, and these social interactions can be of two types. The interactions could be between human beings and nature, or between human beings and with one another. And these interactions, for example, the interaction of humans with nature, things like agriculture, building materials, so on, come from nature. But then interaction of the human with themselves develop social networks. We develop unique forms of culture and government. We have history. And all of this gives us certain levels of knowledge which we use to build environments. We need to create systems of education and public transport. And so all of this sort of network of social creations affect human health and well-being in very individual ways. And I would present some data supporting the idea that all these things individually and perhaps collectively affect human disease health risk. So once we sort of know that the social environment is important, that we could then be able to understand which components may have the most significant influence. The most significant influence of the social environment on our health is the socioeconomic status of an individual. Of course, we do not know why, but we do know that people who have much greater means and have much greater resources, and more importantly, a sort of a positive attitude in life, have much lower levels of heart disease. And this has been shown for every community around the globe, and there is some data here showing that as you become more and more educated, for example, if you're going from 0 to 8th grade education to college grade education, there is at least a 10–15% decrease in mortality. There is also a decrease in all-cause mortality because of due to income. And there are many, many reasons that underlie this. Part of the reasons could be a better access to medical care, but that doesn't explain the whole story. There are other influences, for example, a better control of your life, a better better life choices, and so on. So we're still trying to sort this out, but it is undeniable that socioeconomic status is a key determinant of all-cause mortality, and particularly cardiovascular disease. So one component of the social environment is the set of social networks, and we are essentially parts of networks, and some have argued not discrete individuals per se. And because of our sort of belonging in the network, the health and the quality of our network is an important determinant of our individual health and mortality. We are affected by social networks and things that change. We know that, for example, we are influenced by family and friends, and this is sort of anecdotal, everybody knows that, but a formal analysis which brought this out very interestingly was from the Framingham Heart cohort, and the Framingham cohort showed that, followed for over 45 years, showed that people of one type tends to aggregate with each other. For example, this is measuring BMI, and as you can see that the distribution is non-random, and that people with like BMI cluster with people with like BMI, and people with low BMI tend to cluster in different discrete clusters, suggesting that people of like nature are associated with themselves with people who are like them, or the vice versa. We know that your risk of smoking increases if somebody around you is smoking. We know the risk of obesity increases if somebody around you is obese. The best evidence we have for a genetic cause of obesity is a gene that's been called the FAT gene, or fatty acid transporter gene. And if you have that variant of the gene, then you have a 5% excessive risk of being obese. But if you have an obese friend, your risk of obesity increases by 50%. So you could see the relative influence of the environment and gene on our choices, behavior, and health. In part of social networks, we exist not only individually, but also create an environment that facilitates these interactions. For that, we create environments that cluster us close together. And so we live in densely packed cities, and in these cities and their characteristics also affect health, particularly cardiovascular disease risk. And this is one evidence about how a place matters. And this is people with the same income. For example, people making between $8,000 here, maybe $25,000 here. But even within the same income bracket, if a neighborhood is more advantaged, the lifespan is greater than if the neighborhood is more disadvantaged. And the disadvantaged neighborhoods are classified by neighborhoods where there are broken windows and the garbage is not cleaned up every other day or so on. So if you categorize people into different types of neighborhoods, then even with the same income, there is a difference in life expectancy. And so it's not just the socioeconomic status, but the quality of the social networks and the environments that we live in that makes a big difference. If we live around environments that are highly constructed, that we have and then we have limited capacity for physical interaction, physical activity, suddenly we are going to be disadvantaged and would have less incentive to work or to be physically active. So the built environment can be related to cardiovascular disease in a variety of different scenarios because the built environment determines how much walkability there is, how much urban green spaces there are, what types of building and public transportation, and believe it or not, there's very good evidence supporting for each one of them. There's showing, for example, that public transportation or the number of transit stations is related to the amount of level of obesity in a community. We do know that people who live next to major roadways have higher cardiovascular mortality and then higher cardiovascular disease risk, and that the way land is used and distributed within urban communities can be a good predictor of cardiovascular disease risk. So as a result of these built environments and socioeconomic disparities, we end up with something like this. And this is one of the American cities called New Orleans. And in the city, we see that if you look at one side of the city, you could have a life expectancy of 55 years. But if you move another few miles, you can see a life expectancy of 71 years. So this is the level of disparity that's not really unusual for New Orleans. There could be wide differences even within a few miles, and that may be because of a variety of reasons which we don't fully comprehend. But the idea is that if we do understand the levels or the mechanisms underlying the disparity, then we can do a lot to increase the average lifespan of individuals living in the inner city by 10 years without even resorting to any medical treatment or disease treatment or surgical management. So why is this such large disparity has been bothering a lot of people for a long time, but I think we have a little grasp of the problem. But one of the components that we do know and that contributes to the differences between intercity differences in mortality may be air pollution. We know that from WHO that there are about 8 million premature deaths could be linked to air pollution worldwide. In the United States, about 150,000 deaths could be linked to air pollution. And of the people who die from air pollution, about 80% of those deaths are from cardiovascular disease. So we have to be cognizant of the high burden of cardiovascular disease that's imposed by polluted air. Where is the polluted air in the country? As you can see that most of it resides in the Ohio Valley. I think this is appropriate for Ohio Valley Society of Toxicology to know that we live in one of the most polluted areas in the country, and that there is a small, or not a small, but a subsequent hotspot near Alabama, near Birmingham, and then a lot of air pollution in the West Coast in Los Angeles, where it's been remarked that good air goes to die. So all of the areas of Los Angeles and San Fresno Valley is highly polluted and continues to do so. I'm sure you've heard of the stories that have been out in the press recently. So the areas of high levels of air pollution are also associated with the high levels of premature mortality. And as you can see, that much of that could be localized to areas in California, Ohio Valley, and the Deep South. These areas also contain high levels of particulate matter as well as high levels of ozone. So we wanted to see whether or not that there would be some effect of this air pollution in a sub-threshold or subclinical markers of cardiovascular disease. So we did an experiment or a study in which we went to Salt Lake City, Utah, Provo, Utah, and that actually is a valley. As you can see that during winter there are episodes of inversion, and these episodes of inversion means you have large levels of air pollution build up. in the area. So if you can look at this graph, you'll see that PM levels from 5 can go to over 100 within a day and come back quite predictably, and they can cycle between these levels. So we went to that place and we recruited a soccer team of young soccer players, and we got blood from them before, during, and after the inversion, and we could see that as the PM levels increased, there was a decrease in their endothelial progenitor cells, which are a marker of the regenerative capacity of the blood vessels. And so this would suggest that there is some subclinical endothelial injury in these individuals that appears to be associated with the levels of air pollution in the area. But since these were human studies, we knew that there could be other variables as well. So we wanted to confirm this finding and see if it was valid, rigorous observation in a much more controlled condition. So we came back and we had set up, this is our inhalation chamber, in which we concentrate air, polluted air from Freud and Muhammad Ali, just a few blocks from here. And then we exposed mice either to filtered air, or we sort of compare to the concentrated polluted air. And what we saw in humans is what we saw in mice as well, that there was a decrease in the endothelial progenitor cells as the function of exposure, and suggesting that this is not a sort of a freak association from a rather badly confounded human study, but that it seems to be a genuine phenomenon that exposure to air, to polluted air, particularly PM, would decrease the levels of endothelial progenitor cells. We also did a study within the city of Louisville, went around the town and collected blood from, we didn't actually go around the town, we collected blood from people from around the town and who came to our cardiology clinic for primary and secondary prevention, and we found that people who were living next to major roadways has high levels of endothelial progenitor cells and would be indicative of continuing damage to the blood vessels. We did another study. This was our study with Utah, and we looked at a lot of different sort of cytokines and growth factors and how they would be affected in the plasma. And what we found essentially was the growth factors that are associated with an anti-angiogenic profile were increased, but the growth factors such as PDGF, EGF, and VEGF, which are pro-angiogenic, were suppressed. So it sort of corresponds with the idea that there may be some aspects of air pollution that suppress angiogenesis. We also found evidence for some subclinical endothelial injury, and here we're measuring endothelial microparticles that bud off and fall away from upon exposure to air pollution, and so we think that there is an increase in the levels of the circulating endothelial microparticles as a function of particulate matter. But the thing that the case I'm trying to make is not that we are going to understand these things in isolation, but also together collectively. And so we're sort of working on the concept of a pollutome, and the pollutome can consist again of these three different domains of the natural, social, and personal environments. You can trace different levels of, or different sources of pollution into all of these different environmental domains. And then we should be able to understand how the interaction of these sources and different pollutants from different domains affect human health. But because there is sort of a co-relationship between all of this, that is important to understand that the codependencies and develop much more complicated models than we're using so far to account for multi-pollutant exposure. But finally, the most proximal environment to ourselves is what we call the personal environment. And the personal environment is, again, the environment, a micro-environment that we create around ourselves, which is populated by mostly by our own choices, sometimes as a force of circumstance. People are born in poorer, less privileged environments, have no choice. They're just born in those environments. But sometimes there are choices. So the personal environment could then be looked upon as comprised of your personal income and your wealth and education, your physical activity, your choices of chemicals that you choose to use, such as tobacco or alcohol or pharmaceutical drugs, and these may be some believe are lifestyle choices and have been attributed to individual violation, but some of these could be traced to the social environment that we live in. For instance, you can always blame an individual for not exercising enough, not being physically active, and that's their personal choice, and that's why they're obese and fat and they have heart disease. But then we put people in environments where it's not safe to walk, and they do not have any access to open spaces where they could walk, exercise as a matter of routine. So although we could attribute individual choices, these are largely constrained by the structure of the social environment around ourselves. So the architecture of our choice is constrained by the types of things that are around us. For example, smoking. If there is smoking in certain areas, we see it's a personal choice. But we can, without variation, see that in communities that have high levels of smoke outlets have higher levels of smoking rates. And we all know that tobacco industry targets areas of underprivileged areas and towns and supports or actually fuels the high rates of tobacco consumption in those societies. So we have to, if we need to understand personal environments, we need to understand not only personal choices, lifestyle choices, but how they're governed by the social environment. And this social environment, this personal environment is not just an individual, but also type of the house that they live in. I'm sure there's a lot of toxicology which relates to indoor exposure to pollutants and to different types of things that are present in our immediate environment at home. But there are other choices that we make, and the most important choice, for example, is nutrition. I think that's the single most important thing that we can, which is important determinant of health. These choices are also determined not only by your own personal taste, but the type of history and culture that you belong to. Food is like language. It is unique to each community. Just like each community has a little different dialect of speaking, we have different flavors of food that we prefer. And so and when we live with our parents, we not only do we inherit their genes, but we also inherit eating habits and nutritional choices from them, and they inherit those from the society in turn. We also are subject to our choices also constrained by things like the food networks and how food is distributed within a community, and also how it is advertised. There are children who grow up in the United States today who every day see, whatever, an hour worth of television advertising for food, and obviously then they're going to choose to eat that unhealthy food and eat more often. So individual choices are heavily biased by the type of advertisement and social networks that individuals grow up in. So in order to understand those choices, we have to understand not only individual choice or individual willpower, but also the community that that individual lives in. The same could be said about physical activity. It is a personal choice, but there is also a very strong environmental component. There was a study showing that the rate of obesity in any community is inversely proportional to its density. So if people live at a higher density, they're less obese. And so simply one treatment of obesity would be to put everybody together to live in a very high density, which is similar to that of, say, New York City or London or Paris. Because when people live very close together, they shop, they walk to work, they're running, they're walking the kids to school, they're running trying to evade all the muggers or people who are mobbing them. And so that gives you a lot of activity and advice. You try to catch planes or trains so that activity, physical activity, should be part of normal daily life and not something you deliberately go to a particularly demarcated place to indulge in. All these arguments have also been made for the case of smoking, which remains the most common preventable cause of death in the world. And although it is again a personal choice, it's determined by the state taxes, it's determined by social networks, by social norms. The biggest thing that we, as part of the American Heart Association, did over the last 40 years was not just to say the smoking is bad, which never really sunk into a lot of people and still hasn't, but that to denormalize smoking. Because if we made smoking cool or uncool, then that is going to make the biggest difference, because our social pressures are very large. And what we are worried about now in the last 5 years is that we have suddenly seen the emergence of this new tobacco delivery devices like electronic cigarettes and electronic hookahs, and those things have been deemed cool again. And so we are fighting desperately to denormalize any type of tobacco use if we are to sort of preserve the gains we have made against big tobacco. But overall, this would come to sort of the whole idea of environmental medicine, that we have to identify individual environmental causes to human disease, and only then we might be able to get to the disease more deeply, rather than sort of doing a Band-Aid fix by treating people with disease and drugs. But even when we do treat them with disease and drugs, we can look at environmental factors and sort of tease out reasons that determine, or the factors that determine compliance. For example, people in different environments, even if you give them the same drugs, are not compliant. About 50% of the people that we prescribe hypertensive medicine to don't take the medicines. And the reason they don't take it is because they can't afford the medicines, they don't trust the doctor, the culture between the physician and the healthcare professional is different from the culture of the patient, and all these really profound environmental factors interfere even with just the treatment of disease. And then there are also changes in sort of drug availability. There are people who just cannot afford to get all these drugs. So it is not simply that we give the drugs to a person and forget about their environmental conditions, but they have to be considered not only in disease prevention, but also in disease treatment. Also, when you treat people, then the environments may have different responses. People who are taking the same drug may respond differently depending upon whether they live in deserts, on trees, or in green areas. So we need to be able to look at all these interactions and the type of environments that people are in. But in terms of specific, like say, animal toxicology, which I think many of you are interested in, how do we put that in this framework? So here's sort of one way of looking at it. We know that there is a natural environment. We know there's a meteorology, geography, and ecology, and they affect pollution and toxicant exposure. And that there is a lot of work and science understanding how, for example, ozone is formed in the outer atmosphere, how PM is dispersed and collected, and that's part of what we call atmospheric sciences. But when these pollutants are generated by built environments, such as industry and traffic and chemical production, then we have to be able to develop models that we can do source apportionment or source attribution, and those are important to understand where these pollutants are coming from and how they differ in their characteristics. People have been thinking of PM as one monolith exposure, but PM from, say, agriculture sources is maybe less toxic than PM that is developed from generated by traffic. So we have to be cognizant of the different environmental sources of the pollutants that we study. We also have to be cognizant of the different types of pollutants that we expose together, so as a multi-pollutant or multi-exposure systems, and that has been very often ignored because it's very complicated to address multi-pollutants, but we have to be cognizant of that, not only other pollutants when you think of chemicals, but also pollutants such as noise and light. There's a lot of studies showing that even exposure to low levels of noise can double your risk of heart disease, diabetes, and insulin resistance, especially if there's nocturnal perturbation. And also there is some evidence that light pollution may be contributing to, say, the higher incidence of breast cancer or maybe cardiovascular disease. Since the industrial age, we are living in this artificially lit environment. We are constantly desynchronized with the cycles of night and day. So we have in a state of constant vulnerability. So in taking all this into account, we can then figure out what are the effect modifiers of our drugs and toxins, which could be actually sometimes simulated in animal models. For example, stress can be stimulated, and we know that animals that are under stress may have higher or different responses to exposure to pollutants. We know that nutrition can change the levels of drug detoxification enzymes. Dr. Conklin just published a paper showing that if you feed mice high-fat diet, then the GST levels change. And so the way we metabolize drugs may depend upon the nutritional state of that particular individual. And so once we know that, then also we can understand that how different toxins and drugs affect human health and what are the different states of vulnerability, sort of population vulnerability and human susceptibility. So to put all this together, we're trying to develop what we call the Envirome Institute, and the mission of this institute is to enable and support research to understand the effects of the environment on our health, and to promote the understanding that the environment plays a key, sort of primitive and primeval role in the risk of chronic diseases, both locally and globally. And in order to do that, we need to understand not only individual choices, but our social, physical, and geographic features that in urban environments affect our health, and that we would develop some sort of a model that would sort of enable us to say something significant and meaningful about how healthy lives are lived in urban environments and in this sort of technologically advanced age that we are in. So to sort of address this in one way, we developed this new project which we call the Green Heart Project, and in this project we adopted a neighborhood and see if we change one component of the environment, what will happen. So the first thing we did was to actually go to the neighborhood, do a detailed map of the different sources or levels of pollution. This is showing a sort of a mobile monitoring across this neighborhood. And we found that some areas have actually more pollution than the other. And knowing that would help us a great deal. So to see where are the hotspots in the community, we went to the community and looked at things like social cohesion and so on, to be able to understand how the community is functioning. We are going to recruit 700 people to be able to understand what happens to the cardiovascular disease risk. And so we would do a close exam, and then after we've done all of that, we would go to this community and plant trees. Now, if you plant trees, that is going to take 30 years for these trees to develop, and we would not be around to complete the study. So we're going to plant very large trees, which is about 30 to 40 foot trees, and we want to plant like about at least 10,000 of these trees within the community, and then go back 2 years later and see how does it affect not only the cardiovascular health of the community, but also its social interactions, its sort of the physical activity of the people in the community, birth rates, and so on, so that we can get an assessment of how changing one component of the environment, i.e. the natural environment, could affect the overall domain of the environment that people live in. So this is the first test of the idea that there are different components of the environment which have been recognized for so long and have been sort of talked about and written, and certainly as social determinants of health. But the claim here is that they are not isolated components, they are related to each other, and much could be learned from understanding the relationship of the different components of the environment rather than simply naming them that they are this, they are this, they are that. So if we can understand the structure of this, of our external environment and how they function, just as we are trying to understand the structure and the function of how our genes function, then we might be able to put the two things together, and we have not only a better understanding of human health and disease risk, but also how to promote healthy living. So I'm going to stop there and thank all of you for being here and for listening to this quite so patiently.
I know it's a lot to take in. Go ahead.
Yes, sir.
So, I think it was earlier on you had that altitude. How do you know you're not just bored? Not like random correlation.
Right, so that's a really interesting question. The most to me, the most convincing evidence comes from the migration studies. So particularly in China, when there are people living in Tibet, their birth rate defect rates or cardiac birth defect rates is less than 0.01%. But when the Han Chinese who've been adapted to lowland living moved to Tibet, then their birth defect rates were 10 times as high. So we know that there is a definite effect of the environment on cardiac disease. The same thing happened in the Andes. So when the Europeans went to the Andes and they took their livestock with them, all their cows and the pigs developed muscularization of the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery. So these things could be induced within a few generations. So we think that there may be sort of a causative relationship. There has been a lot of really elegant studies on the exercise capacity of people who live in Tibet, and their hemoglobin has a different mutation rate, so it can retain more oxygen, plus their cardiac output is greater. I told you that there are people who live in Andes and their coronary tree is twice the density of the coronary tree of a sea level dweller. So these may not, maybe not sort of rise up to the level of causal in some sense, but there is a very strong evidence that living in higher environments or higher altitudes can completely change human physiology, so they adapt to them better. There is also direct evidence that people who live in altitudes have a higher lifespan and lower levels of hypertension and cardiac disease. Now that could be because of lots of different things, including food habits, socioeconomic status, and so on. But given the anatomical, genetic, and social evidence showing that they have better adapted, that there's a strong case to be made that altitude has a beneficial effect on cardiovascular disease risk. Thank you.
Still within your power to make a
Oh, that's really very easy. The single most largest cause of preventable death is smoking. And so if we are trying to, and this is, I'm being serious, with the American Heart Association, we're trying to develop this new idea called the end game for nicotine. And we think that we are at a right opportune moment, that maybe in the next 50 years, there'll be no nicotine in human societies anymore. So if we do that, we are going to save a large number of lives. By some estimate, from now to the end of the century, about 1 billion people will die prematurely because of smoking. And so if we can prevent 1 billion deaths, that would be more than we can do with anything else that we can think of, at least for now.
I just figured that would be the answer, and my follow-up is, what's that difference from?
Okay, so again, I would say one of the failure of prevention to date, we have tried everything. We still have 30 million people in the United States smoking. And that's because we have always attributed this to personal choice. We have been saying that you're smoking because you're making bad choices. But if we step back and realize that these choices are determined by a whole set of factors, not actually attributable to the individual, and then we can do something on a societal level that could change it, that makes the biggest difference. The largest amount of smoking, only 3 groups have remained smokers in the United States today. They are, 1, people of low socioeconomic status and lower means, 2, people who are belong to the LGBT community, and 3, people who have mental health issues, right? So you cannot just take smoking and say, you need to stop smoking. That doesn't, I mean, it worked for most people. It's not going to work there. So we need to go back and look at in what I would advocate in a Rome point of view, and try to see that there are these mental issues. These people who have been marginalized from the community, and if we can do and work on socializing or renormalizing or reintegrating these people from the edges of society into the middle of the society, then we might be able to control not only tobacco, but other drug abuse as well. And so this has not been really been thought of carefully, that how non-individual factors contribute to addiction in society and how they could be altered. For example, you can increase tobacco tax and you will get a 5% whatever. But then that plateaus. After some times, it doesn't matter how much tax you increase. Some people are going to smoke regardless. They would go without food. So we have to then find out what are the drivers of this sort of addiction. And that brings us back to stress, social marginalization, your feeling of where you belong to in life. The best people who adhere to cardiovascular disease drugs and have the best cardiovascular risk profile are people who have what we call sort of a valued purpose of life. Right? If you have no purpose in life, you say, oh, I'm going to die, I don't really care if my blood pressure is high, whatever. But if you have something to live for, right, then it's a whole different sort of scenario. So we have to step back and try this unusual approaches to prevention. Yes, ma'am. In the Ohio Valley, the pollution, actually, most of the, yes, so the sources of pollution are actually 2. One is near the Manhattan region, New York, and there's Chicago. But the pollution comes eastward and it accumulates in the Ohio Valley because of our geography, but also our climate. It comes downwind from Chicago and it comes from west from New York City. Then you see just accumulating there, and you can see the trend. There are actually, if you look at the heights of trees in Manhattan, the higher than on the western edge of the city because pollution comes in that direction. And so in Ohio Valley we get several weather systems that sort of accumulate, and in summer we have very high levels of heat plus traffic, so it generates a lot of ozone. And the same thing in California, because there the air pollution go in the sea, but when the wind blows usually, which is the other way around, there are mountains that trap this whole polluted air within Los Angeles. Again, you have so much sunshine and so much traffic, you have huge amounts of ozone. Yes? They are for the same reason, because all the pollen is trapped here. The thing with we have a double problem because we are also very green. California is not that green. So we have greenery, much more greenery here, and so therefore the seasonal allergies are much higher here than elsewhere. Well, yeah, that's right. but quite quickly, for the pollution, we have improved a lot. We used to be number 10 of the top 10 cities in the country in air pollution. Now we have slid down to number 14, so we are improving. And part of that is to work on emission sources, diversion of traffic, roads, and certainly we are going to make gains by decreasing the levels of sort of industry that we have in the area. The bad news is that because of climate change, this is going to get even worse. Allergies are going to be at least twice as bad in the next 25 years, and air pollution levels are going to drastically increase because of the number of hot days that are going to happen. And so we have come down, I think, then we are going to go back up because of the global warming. Yes? Right, so this goes back to the work that we are trying to do here, which is, yes, we should have all the components of the environment together, but we do not know what the components are to begin with, and how do we put them together, right? So if, for example, if you didn't know anything about genes and you ground up the DNA and you say you only found 4 bases, whatever. So we need to develop an understanding of this, what are the components of the environment, and we don't know. We tend to place haphazardly things together. We say social determinants of disease, and the social determinants, 1, built environment, 2, social networks. Now, built environments, social networks are categorically different things, right? Those are things, and social networks are relationships. So it's like putting genes and proteins and everything together, grinding up and saying, I want to do an omic study. You can't do that. You have to separate out genes from one way, metabolize another, right? So, but in any case, we do need to understand the different components of the environment, and we can't wait till we have a better understanding. So there are lots of initiatives trying to do this. There is the study sponsored by NIH called All of Us, and I would sort of recommend that you enroll, or everybody here should enroll in the study. It's called All of Us, and the study is to look at the environmental causes of disease, and we can then be able to collect data from several million people, and then be able to make some sense out of it. It's the whatever sort of paradigm of omics work with no hypothesis, no outcomes, but let's just look, we might find something interesting. But that's a start. So we're going to do that. There are people trying to do that in different countries. They're trying to look at how environmental conditions affect health. And so unless we have a very good understanding of what we are trying to collect and what is the ontology. Suppose you do a gene analysis, you do the entire genomic analysis or a transcriptome analysis, but you have no gene ontology, you can't make sense of it. And there's only 40,000 genes. So unless we have an environmental or envirome ontology, we can't really systematically study the environment. That's what I'm saying. All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you,
Sure.